Welcome to another episode of Growth Hacker TV. I'm Bronson Taylor, and today I have Dick Talens with us. Dick, thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me, man.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, Dick, you are the Chief Growth Officer at Fitocracy. So let's start there. Tell us a little bit about Fitocracy. First, what is it?
So Fitocracy is a fitness social network. It helps everyone get to the next level of fitness, and we do this through a combination of community. That's our main focus on Fitocracy. But we also leverage gamification and tracking as well as content and knowledge. So we help users who have different goals and might be at different parts of their fitness journey. And we tell them, here's what you need to do next. Here are the people you should connect to. And here's how many points you earned for what you did. Here's like a little score for what you did. And so the entire platform is created to help people level up their fitness.
Gotcha. So it's kind of community, it's kind of gamification, which seems like both of those would be really strong in terms of helping people get in shape.
Yeah, that's exactly right. As it turns out, gamification it's really good at bringing people in, and it's really good at getting them moving at the start. But the diminishing returns on gamification kick in really, really soon. So community is actually what keeps people for a long amount of time. And we've done a lot of analysis to figure this out, both qualitatively and quantitatively.
Yeah, and here in a minute I want to get into the gamification a little more, and you can tell us about that because that's interesting.
Yep.
But tell us first, what was kind of the impetus for starting Fitocracy? Was there a story behind there or something?
Yeah, so growing up, I used to be a really, really fat kid, 220 pounds at my max. I was super chubby. I was like the kid that everyone kind of made fun of at school. Actually more of a class clown than anything else, but super fat kid. At some point, because I'm a geek, I started geeking out about fitness in the same way I geek out about video games. And so I learned everything I could about nutrition, exercise, both the physiological aspects of that and also the kind of psychology behind following a protocol, and became an amateur bodybuilder. And so when me and my partner Brian decided that we wanted to start a company, Brian also had a very similar background, except coming from the other end of the spectrum. He was a super skinny kid. He was like a beanpole growing up. We decided to start a company that would help people make the same kind of transformations that we made. And given the fact that we were both video gamers growing up, we started Fitocracy with the initial concept of turning fitness into a game.
Gotcha. Now, I've heard that Arnold Schwarzenegger actually uses your product. Is that right?
He actually does. And how we got Arnold on Fitocracy is a little bit of a growth hacking story.
Yeah.
But he uses Fitocracy. He runs the Arnold Challenge, the Arnold 1% Challenge, which gets people to spend 1% of their day on fitness. So that's 15 minutes of their day. And every single month we have a new exercise that Arnold or somebody from Arnold's team or some fitness pro puts out. And people follow that challenge. If you do that exercise 15 times in a month, you get a badge. If you get 3 of those badges, you get a cooler badge. And it's a really fun way to get people started on fitness.
Gotcha. That's cool. So tell us about the growth of Fitocracy, because that's really what our audience is, concerned about. How big has Fitocracy grown over the years?
Yep. So right now we're approaching 1.5 million users or so.
Wow.
For context, we launched our iOS app last year in March. So March 2012, when we launched our iOS app, we were at about 200,000 users. And before that, we were in closed beta. And closed beta got us from 0 to 200,000 users. And if you think about the fact that, you think about a fitness app, it should be mobile, right? You enter stuff in at the gym. Otherwise, you're going to have to enter it in your computer after the gym. Well, we didn't have an iOS app until March 2012, despite launching in November of 2010. So we had to utilize a lot of growth hacking in order to get to 200,000 users without an app.
Yeah, and here in a second, actually, tell me now, what did you do to get from 0 to 200,000? Because it's hard to imagine closed beta, no iPhone app. It's about fitness, and somehow you still have a fifth of a million users.
Yeah. So I guess it's best broken up. I guess the strategies and the tactics that we used are best broken up into different stages, right? So for context, because this is important, it was started by me and my co-founder Brian, and neither of us had any technical ability. We weren't coders or designers, so the first iteration of Fitocracy was just absolute crap. And so to get from 0 to 1,000, 2,000 users, we had to be extremely creative, right? And so what we did is we really leveraged our founder story, right? Because if you look at a lot of fitness products, there's not a lot of authenticity behind them. It's a lot of people trying to make money or who don't understand the fitness space. Whereas with myself and Brian, we've been living, breathing, eating, whatever fitness for the last decade. And so we really honed in on that founder story. Eventually, we ended up posting on Reddit about starting this website that turns fitness into a game. Brian posted that both of us were geeks. Brian and I were Redditors, and that really resonated with people. And so people tried out Fitocracy, even if it wasn't the best. It wasn't even any good. They still used it. They still registered. And we got about 2,000 users that way in the span of a week or so. After that, we kind of got to the next phase where it's like, okay, now we actually need features. So Brian and I started coding out features that people on Reddit said they wanted, because now we had people to tell us, here's what we'd like to see on Fitocracy. I think that this is what would make me use the product. We had no analytics or no metrics back then, right? Because we didn't really have users using the product. We had users who aspired to use the product. And so all of our growth hacking was really qualitative. So lots of customer development, lots of figuring out what people wanted. So we built those features out. And then I guess the biggest key for getting to 200,000 users is that we made Fitocracy private beta. And we did that for a few reasons. One is we didn't know how to scale. And so at some point, if 100 people were on the site at the same time, the database would get pinged 10,000 times and the site would crash. But then the second, I guess there are multiple reasons. The second reason is because we really believed in community, right? And we wanted to make sure that not only did our technical stuff scale, but our community scaled as well. And that we gave a lot of due attention to new users who joined Fitocracy. And then the third reason is obviously there's the marketing aspect behind it. If you have a club with a nice velvet rope around it and people waiting in line, then people are going to want to line up. And so what we did is we gave everyone 10 invite codes. Those 10 invite codes, and I think the way that we did it is pretty important because it led to the most amount of what we call invite trains that would occur. So everyone would get 10 invite codes, and your code might be ADFGH, right? Once 10 of those were used up, obviously no one could join Fitocracy using that code. So what people would do is take their invite code back to their home forums. And so they take them back to the most random forums on the internet, like poker forums, car forums, even forums for new mothers, for example. And they would say, check out the site, Fitocracy, I have an invite code. It made them feel really special because they were the first person kind of on the scene. They'd post their code on forums. All 10 would get used up. And once all 10 got used up, somebody else would post. So you had these invite trains, which is threads long and long and long. And you can go to teamliquid.net, for example, and there's going to be some, that's I believe a gamer, a StarCraft forum. If you look there, you can actually see the original posts. Something Awful, the forum as well, you can see the original Fitocracy posts, and it's just people posting their invite codes. So that got us to about 200,000 users. And we spent a lot of time really making sure that those users had a good experience, as good an experience as we could provide, given that we didn't really have a development team.
Yeah. So you got from 0 to 2,000 through kind of Reddit in the community there. You got from 2,000 to 200,000 through kind of a closed rope invite, closed beta system.
Exactly.
And then at 200,000, that's when you launched the iPhone iOS app, right?
Exactly.
So did it just take off on its own up to 1.5 at that point, or were there still things that you had to do to prime the pump and get from 200 to 1.5?
Yeah. So most of our distribution now comes from App Store. In order to get a lot of leverage from the App Store, we did a few creative things around keywords. I can't really give too many details, but let's just say that, if you think about the way Apple does its algorithms, there are probably some keywords that will lead some users to come in more than others, right? If somebody searches for fitness tracker, you want to be the first person on the scene there. So there's some testing that you can do in between releases, right? You can't A/B test, obviously, because it's just not possible. But you can run certain tests and say, let's say I put, and this is just, I'm making this up, I'm pulling it out of my ass. You could say, let's say I put tracker in the title and tracker in the description. all right, let's see how that affects rankings. All right, what if I take out tracker from the title, but keep it in the description? All right, do rankings fall? All right, what if I keep tracker in the keywords? So you can see like how to maximize. Yeah. So that led to a significant bump in rankings. And unfortunately, what we realized later is that I'll start geeking out now.
Yeah,
you've got multiple types of metrics, right? You've got vanity metrics, and you've got metrics that actually matter and are a gauge of how large your audience size is. What we find out is that when you do, I guess, growth hacks, like very, very high ROI growth hacks, like keyword hacking, you get a lot of users who find out about your product and they're unqualified, so they're not like organic users. And depending on the keyword, they might expect one thing and get something else, right? And so, despite the fact that doing that kind of stuff with keywords, blew up distribution, you saw a decrease in activation and retention because those users were incredibly, unqualified. And now thinking back, I'm not sure if while on the vanity side it looks great, I'm not sure if that actually made us a better product because I'm sure a lot of those users won't come back, right? And so it might have actually been better to grow slower and focus our efforts on optimizing for engagement and retention, which we eventually did. The other thing we did to get to 1.5, and this is where Arnold really kicks in. We spent a lot of time networking the fitness scene, right? So if you go to any fitness pro who's trying to build a reputation online and ask them like, what's the top site on the internet? Most of them will say Fitocracy. And we did this because number one, we reached out to them, right? And we just became their buddies, right? We, me and Brian and other people from Fitocracy, when fitness pros are in town, we just like go drinking, have a fun time with them. So there's like a lot of the softer side of like networking. And like there's no intention there. I like legitimately love all the people in the fitness industry who I hang out with. And so what that did is that allowed us to, make friends in the fitness industry who eventually led us to Arnold, because Arnold is also very connected in the fitness industry. We also figured out how to help people best in the fitness industry and use that in order to leverage network effects. So what I mean by that is, if you think about content, right? Content creates network effects with your audience and people who create that content. Because if you have a large audience, then people who create content are going to want to reach that audience. Those people create content. That content, gets to your audience. It's spread. That grows your audience size. And that larger audience is going to attract more people who are willing to create content. And so we spent a lot of time figuring out, like, how can we help these fitness pros best? Who are the best pros in the business? And me and my partner are also very, very firm believers that a lot of the fitness industry is broken. So what we tried to do is be, the reputable brand that told, mainstream users or mainstream internet folk which fitness pros were worth following. And so we very much became, I guess, the gatekeepers of, whose brand we should promote.
Yeah.
And so, we, just networked with the fitness industry. They started creating content for us. They started telling their followers about Fitocracy because we had a good relationship. That eventually led to Arnold. And, when it comes to fitness, you only hear about fitness through a few channels. Like most mainstream people, right? They'll see it on like Oprah or Dr. Oz. Both are like bullshit sources. They'll hear about it or they'll Google, how do I lose weight? So you've got Google, and then they'll hear about it from celebrities like Kim Kardashian, Arnold Schwarzenegger, et cetera. And so you think about the big wins in distribution. It's one of those, search is just like way too saturated. Like you're not going to compete with fitness in search unless you're like a demand media. You're not going to compete with demand media in search. And then, getting on Oprah, Dr. Oz, that's a little bit more difficult. So we very much thought about what celebrities we could leverage or who would give us those big wins, and Arnold was one of them.
Yeah, that's great. It seems that one of the themes that I hear that kind of permeates so much of your story is something I've been thinking about lately, which is team market fit. We hear so much about product market fit, which is important, but I think there's a lot to be said for team market fit because you guys seem to have such an authentic story. It's real. It's who you are. You actually love the industry you're serving, and that's going to allow you, I think, to make so many little decisions well that you wouldn't have if you actually weren't the right people to serve this industry. Do you guys feel like that's a big part of your success, having that team market fit?
Yeah, I think I definitely think that is the reason for our success. And I don't say that like in any sort of like egotistical way. I'm actually like very fortunate that I was lucky enough to be like a fat kid growing up and play video games. But I think I think people oftentimes attribute success to product, and product is definitely a pivotal part of success. But I know at least with Fitocracy, the reason our product is so good is because we were able to attract rock stars who honestly shouldn't be working for us. Like for example, our chief product officer. This guy is the guy who redesigned WebMD to go to the number one health site on the internet. He designed our entire website and took it from like what me and Brian did to like something that is beautiful. Like we were so embarrassed.
It is beautiful right now. I'll say that. I see a lot of stuff. I analyze a lot of stuff. Your all's design has a good like quality to it. It feels like approachable yet still well designed.
Thank you. Yeah, we were embarrassed to show our product before, like when Brian and I would demo, because it was like blue. It was like made by two dudes. But the guy that we hired as our chief product officer, he was an absolute rock star. And like there's no reason that he should be working for Fitocracy except that he's super passionate about our mission, right? That's why he's doing it. Our first CTO, he was originally a chemical engineer in Texas, and he quit his job in Texas to come move up to New York to be our first CTO without pay. I mean, he did that because of the team market fit as well. So I think that there's a lot there that people usually attribute to product, but a lot of it has to do with the team.
Yeah, well, the team builds the product. So if the team isn't right, the product can't be right, and it can never be a solution to a market. So it really starts with people that know what they're doing and are the right people for the job to begin with. And I think that's, like you said, you were fortunate to be a fat kid because it gave you team market fit as an adult. So that's awesome.
Yep.
Now let's talk about gamification a little bit. You gave us a kind of a taste of it earlier, and you said something that was kind of surprising. It wasn't what I expected, is that gamification gets them only so far, but then community kind of picks up from there. So walk me through that kind of trajectory. What does gamification do? How is it being used? And then when does it stop? And what does the community do to take over?
Yep. So I'm going to be really controversial here and say that most gamification, if not like almost all gamification, is bullshit, right?
All right. Tell me what you mean.
So a lot of people will use gamification thinking that it will create long-lasting habit, right? It won't be any more than a fad. And they'll often apply it to products that just aren't congruent to gamification, right? Like I see some people in health trying to apply it, not fitness, but health. And it's like, the more info you give us, like the more you're fucking like, can I say that word? We can edit that. Sorry. I have no filter sometimes. The more your levels will go up. And I mean, for some products, it just doesn't work because people don't want to give more information. So that's one way that gamification is used poorly. And the second thing is, the assumption that it will actually build a long-lasting habit. People get very bored very easily. So we'll talk more about like hardcore numbers and Fitocracy with gamification. But whenever we look at users who were retained for a long period of time and have made like significant life changes, we ask them, why did you stay on Fitocracy? And they will frequently tell us for the community. Not a single person mentioned gamification. And so we started looking at the numbers on that. And we started looking at activation. We started looking at like basically all the data that we could get our hands on. It turns out that most people sign up for Fitocracy because they wanted the Trend Fitness into a game aspect. And then we saw that if you submitted, we saw like a huge correlation between people who submitted a workout on day 0 and people who stuck around for the first month versus people who didn't submit a workout. So there was just like a much higher percentage of people who submitted on day 0. So we decided to say, okay, let's call that activation, right? I'm sure most people reviewing this like are already kind of familiar with the funnel. So we call that activation, and then we said, okay, well, if that's activation, why are those people sticking around? The first part was that, okay, well, those users are sticking around because it must be correlation and not causation, right? It's like, all right, if you already know what you're doing, you're probably going to submit a workout on day 0, and that type of person is probably going to stay in Fitocracy because they stuck to fitness. Gotcha. And so we assumed that for a very long time. And then we started looking more at the numbers, right? And we started looking at the interactions that were happening on a deeper level. And we saw that if you had, I think it was like 10 followers by the first week, you were a lot more likely to stay. Then we were like, okay, well, that isn't necessarily causation. It might be causation. It could also be correlation, that there's a specific type of persona who does very well on social networks and they follow more people to start out and they stick around. So we started building these like mental models and started hypothesizing. One of our hypotheses was what if it's not correlation that's getting people to stay? What if it's causation? And that if somebody submits a workout on day 0, when they sign up, they get props from the community, and those props, the prop is like a like on Facebook, and those props lead people to check out who's propping them and follow that person. Because we noticed that on Fitocracy, people would just prop random strangers, which is kind of cool. It's like, you're encouraging people to keep working out. And so we came up with a test, and we said, what if we take the 50 most active people on Fitocracy, most active people in the community, and we got permission for them to auto-prop new users on day 0. Would there be a lift in retention? And so we got their permission. We got maybe half of the 50. And then we wrote a script that would randomize propping to users who met on day 0, and we A/B tested that, and there was a huge lift in retention. And so, because we, I guess, assumed at the start that it was all correlation, not causation, we missed out on a lot of those gains. But just by thinking about the disparate parts and putting it all together, we realized what the overall story was, and that led to a lift.
Yeah. No, I love the story you just gave us, because it's a great example of trying to differentiate between correlation and causation, which is hard. We have all this data, we have all these analytics, but we don't know what's causing what a lot of times.
Exactly.
It's like the book by Kroll, Lean Analytics. Trying to figure out what's causing what. And I like what you guys did. You came up with a test to then show you if there's a causation there, and then you realize there is. So now you can build things in the product to make that happen more so. So that's awesome. Now, I've heard that you guys have engagement numbers that are second in terms of social networks only to Facebook. Is that right?
That is absolutely right. Our average user, average active user, spends 4 hours per month on Fitocracy. So that's more than Twitter, Tumblr, Pinterest, LinkedIn, everything except Facebook.
Yeah.
And the reason is that, well, there are a few reasons. One is that if somebody makes a huge change in their fitness, they are often addicted, right? And so, you look at other apps like Runkeeper and other utility apps like Endomondo. People only use those apps when they are going for a run or going for a bike ride. On Fitocracy, you just explore around. There are people coming back every single day. They'll come back during work. They'll come back at night on their iPad. They'll log their work on Fitocracy. They're spending all day on Fitocracy. And they're doing things like posting cat pictures and interacting with other users. I think one person recorded something ridiculous. It was 20 plus, no, it has to be more. It was 20 to 30 hours on Fitocracy, and we were looking at what this person was doing. And he was just flirting back and forth with women on Fitocracy. And there's a lot of that goes on, right? There's a lot of flirtatiousness, which, it's good to be cognizant of, because it's always good to know the basic human drivers that are keeping people engaged with your product, whether it's aspiring to build wealth or have sex or etc. And we noticed that the people who were spending a lot of time on Fitocracy were spending a lot of time flirting. But I mean, there are a lot of people who obviously don't flirt but still spend a lot of time. But it definitely has to do with the community aspect, right? And I think that is the competitive advantage of a product like Fitocracy, because anyone can build a utility app. You can always build a better Runkeeper. And the community creates, I guess, value that can't easily be replicated.
Yeah. And that's what I was going to ask, is because, when I look on Twitter and you just do a search for Fitocracy, it seems like our users love you at a deep level. They love the product at a deep level. And we've covered a lot of things that kind of make up the whole of Fitocracy. There's the team aspect, you and your coworkers that really are building things. There's the product. It's well designed. It works really well right now, even though the first generation didn't. There's the gamification, really seeing workouts as a video game, which is one of the things that interested you early on. And then there's also this community aspect. Do you feel like their love is kind of all those things combined, or is it just the community? I mean, what do you think?
It's just the community. and also the team. So the one thing that we spend a lot of time doing is actually using the product and being a part of the community and like being transparent. And like on Fitocracy, if you follow like me or Brian or Jared, like we're real people on Fitocracy, right? We're not like a PR bot. So we spend time there like real people. I'll like talk about my day. I'll like talk about like my dating life and like share embarrassing stories on there, which is kind of funny. And like I think that people really identify with that, right? Just because we're authentic. Because I feel like the reason we're like that is because fitness needs to be relatable. Like you mentioned that, I think you said something about relatability or like,
Yeah, just the transparency, the team, and all those things. Yeah.
yeah, like with our design, it's like, we've got our cute robot, it's purple. And those are all intentional because you look at most fitness apps and they're usually very macho.
Yeah.
And so we just try to be really relatable because we are big believers in our mission. And we just want to be as helpful as possible. And part of being helpful means like making sure no one is intimidated when they join Fitocracy.
Yeah. No, that's great. Now, before Fitocracy, you actually worked at ComScore. What
I
was
did.
your role at ComScore? What did you do there?
Yeah, so I was a product manager for the advertising effectiveness team. And I spent a lot of time with not A/B testing, but a lot of analysis around data. Test control things, meta-analyses on lifts and ad. So essentially, my product was responsible for measuring whether or not there was a lift in sales or lift in brand or lift in conversion based on whether or not somebody had saw an impression of an ad. And ComScore can actually, this is pretty cool, can trace to see whether or not, let's say, if Pampers is advertising online, and let's say they spend like hundreds of thousands of dollars, millions of dollars on ad spend, ComScore can measure whether or not that spend translates to a lift in stores. And so I spent a lot of time immersed in that data, and that's where I really figured out the difference between correlation and causation and what makes for good test methodology. It was at ComScore.
Yeah. How would you recommend people kind of learn that skill set? Because, working there, obviously you're going to pick it up. Is there any like things they could do to get a taste of it? Is there a book they can read? Is there something they should do to really get their head around data?
Yeah, I learned a lot just by A/B testing, like little things. Right? Actually, I would say most of what I learned around, that side of growth hacking, the really analytical side, is just by doing. Because if you A/B test things, right, you start to see how people react differently to product, and you start to get the sense of like, is this an actual lift or is it just numbers lying to me because sample size isn't big enough, right? And so you start to get like a feeling of whether or not there was a lift, what kind of sample you need, like what will cause a lift, what might be just like an illusion. I feel like, at least for me, a lot of that is, intuition at the start that you want to test. And I think the only way to get that is by doing.
Yeah. No, that's awesome. And I actually agree is that, you go to the numbers are a hard science and they're awesome. But as you kind of hone your skill set, you have like this kind of sixth sense in terms of what needs to be done and what's correlation and what's causation. And I think you're right. The only way to really get to that point is just by doing stuff. Put out a little product, try to sell something, A/B test anything you can think of. Like, just get around numbers and get around data, because until you get your hands on with it, it's always just someone else's story, a book about someone else's experience.
Exactly, yeah.
It's not your data that you can actually, get things out of. So I like your answer a lot, because that's the way I would answer it.
Yeah, I mean, it's mental masturbation unless you're actually like doing it, right? And you kind of mentioned that like it's a lot about doing and intuition. I think that like if you look at growth hackers, right? Like if I were to pick the qualities in a growth hacker that would make somebody really good, it's not about being like a rock star engineer, right? It's about being somebody who's like extremely empathetic, so they can understand users and understand how they're thinking. Somebody who's creative, so they can create these mental models and say, I wonder if like people are doing this. Well, why doesn't this align with data that we're seeing? Oh, I wonder if I was thinking about this all wrong. Maybe the mental model is like this. And then somebody who like has a basic understanding of numbers, right? And like not an amazing understanding. Because you'll always have like people who are rock stars at math that can always help you out. But being a good growth hacker is, I think, about like a holistic view and having those three qualities.
Yeah, no, that's great. I totally agree. Now let me ask you this. Tell me about the numbers that you're tracking right now that mean a lot to you. Because at every phase of a startup, different numbers are kind of at the forefront. You know, when you first launch, you have 0 users. You're just trying to get anybody to sign up, and you get to 0 to 2,000. But now, sign-ups may not mean as much as something else. So what are you currently kind of thinking about?
Yep. So for us, the number one thing that we're improving is retention, and we measure a lot of things that go into retention. I'll tell you a little bit about that. But yeah, retention is the most important thing for us because fitness, for our product, fitness is hard, right? Like having a fitness site or an app is hard because you have to keep people on the app and you have to keep them going to the gym. And it's not enough to just like grow users. You actually have to keep them. And so we measure, I'd say we split retention up into 3 different things. Number one is what does a user do in the first week or first 2 weeks? So we measure activation. We measure activation. Like I said, activation is submitting a workout. So we really track that and the funnel leading up to activation. And then we measure retention for the first 5 days, week 1, week 2, week 3. We also measure and track a few metrics that we've seen correlate highly to retention. One of them is cross-platform usage. So if a user uses Fitocracy across mobile and across the web, we've seen that that user is a lot more likely to stick around for a while. So we'll track that as well and try to make that go up. The other thing that we measure with retention is kind of current audience size, right? Like how big is your user base? So if you think about like economics, like macroeconomics, right? People or economists have a lot of different tools and different numbers that they can use to, I guess, look at a country or, a GDP or like something differently, right? And so we think about that with Fitocracy, and it's like different metrics are good for measuring audience sizes in different ways, right? So you can look at active users, but let's start from the very top. Like, let's go like vanity to like, signups for visitors, right? That's like the most vanity of vanity metrics. And then you have, let's say 30-day active, right? That's not necessarily a vanity metric. However, if you have a large spike in users and you're not retaining any of them, you're still going to have a high 30-day active number, right? Yeah. So you can split that up. So, what we did is we said, actually, this was in January of this year, we had a deceptively high 30-day active just because so many people signed up. So we're like, okay, how do we separate that into like true actives? So one of the things we did was say, all right, 30-day active, only counting users who were around the site for more than 30 days, right? So 30 days old or more. So that gave us one number. That was a decent measure of how active our user base was or how large our user base was. The other thing is we looked at active users in the last 30 days who have activated. And so we said, okay, well, if you've activated, then we'll count you in the 30-day active. And so those were really useful. But the really, really useful thing that we found is that we said, okay, how do we truly, truly measure how big our user base is right now, like how big our active users are, because we wanted like one clear number just to optimize against. Yeah. And one of the things I was looking into is, do users actually keep using Fitocracy if they don't track anything, right? Like it's a fitness social network, so technically you don't really have to track. You can just like float around. You can use the social aspect and not track. And so I looked at users who weren't tracking at all. And they were like very, very, like users who were coming back but not tracking. There's like very, very, very small amount of them. And then I started thinking about different analyses I could run. And I said, what if you took all the users in the last 7 days, broke them up into those who tracked a workout and those who didn't track a workout? What would their half-life look like, right? And just as a refresher, half-life, in chemistry, it's if a compound deteriorates, I might be butchering this, but if a compound deteriorates, it's like the amount of time that it takes to get to half. Yeah. And so I was like, okay, for these 2 different groups, how long will it take for users who track this week to get, to half and never use the product again? What about users who didn't track? And what we found is that users who did not track, the half-life was something like ridiculously small. It was like 4 days, and it was consistent over any period of time in Fitocracy. We measured it for January 2012, it was consistent. Like summer 2012 was consistent, 2013 it was consistent.
Or they stop using after 4 days.
Yeah, if you took your user base of non-trackers for that week, the half-life is 4 days. And then we looked at the trackers, And it was something really long. It was like half-life is like 60 days. So in 60 days, half of those users will have churned, right? And so what we found out is that like, if you're looking, well, what we found out is that the one metric that really tells us about the health of our user base and like the size of it is users who have tracked in the last 7 days, right?
Gotcha.
And just having that one very distilled, like sophisticated yet simple metric that you can optimize against is just like really powerful, because everything you do, if you focus all of your efforts on optimizing for that metric, and it's a really powerful metric, like everything else will improve.
Yeah. Do you recommend startups kind of imitate that to really work at finding the one metric that is not vanity, that they know actually means something? Because when you tell me in the last 7 days they've tracked something and that's the size of your actual user base, intuitively it makes sense. Like as you said, I'm like, yeah, obviously that's the right metric. Like, because then at any point in time you're seeing a real snapshot of activity, not of signups or past usage, current usage right now, last week. Here's what it is, and it's not 1.5, but it's something that at least we know what it is.
That's exactly right. So I do suggest everyone find that. I mean, you might not find it in the beginning, and it might change over time, but I think once you figure out your other shit, like there's so many things you have to worry about in a startup, but once everything is kind of like coasting along, that's, I think, the right time to jump into analytics.
Yeah.
Because if you do it too early, it's like, all right, you spent all this time just kind of like neck bearding over that one number when like, you don't scale your servers. Like, what does that number matter if like
and the
you're not
sample
gonna...
size is so small, the numbers are almost meaningless anyway.
Yeah. So I mean, it really depends on the timing, but I do think everyone should find the one number that determines the health of their user base.
Yeah, no, that's great. Well, Dick, this has been an awesome interview. I have one last question for you here.
Yep.
It's kind of the high level question. You can take it any way you want. But what's the best advice that you can give to any startup that's watching this and they're trying to grow? What would you tell them?
Startup that's watching this and trying to grow. So I would say, so we did 500 startups, the accelerator, right? And Dave McClure was always like, the default is that you're going to die. Like, if you're a startup, you're probably going to die. So knowing that you're going to die, like, what would you do differently? It's like, just do what other people aren't doing, like make some noise, like go against the grain. Because I think that in the tech scene, you've got this echo chamber and like lots of people who are following others, right? And it's like, oh, should I do this? Well, let me see what this company's doing. And the people who are really growing are those who have like great products and are innovating, because growth hacking means nothing if you have a crap product, right? Like you can only optimize for activation so much until people realize, oh, this product sucks. It's only short-term wins. It's like gamification. It's like short-term wins unless you actually make real change. Where was I going with this? Oh, right. So for startups trying to grow, just like go against the grain, like make some noise. I know that's like abstract, but just for a concrete example, look for a channel that other people aren't tapping, right? Like, I'm just making this example up completely. It's like if you have a startup with, let's say localized events, maybe look at something like OkCupid for distribution and see if there's like any way to like leverage that, right? Just like do things that other people aren't thinking about, and I think that will get people to really win.
Yeah, well, that's awesome advice to end on. Dick, again, thank you so much for coming on Growth Hacker TV.
Thanks, man. Appreciate it.